Hi, I am Mrs. Sloan, and this is a video for my Honors Bio students. We are currently on Chapter 36, and this is Part 2, underneath environmental concerns. And let me make myself a little bit smaller here. So here in Part 2, we're going to discuss the values of biodiversity and sustainability. If you are new to my videos, down in the descriptor at the bottom are the notes my students use. There's a link to them. Column 1 is the scaffolding for that, and column 2, I encourage you to put in pictures. All right, so we are currently at 36.3 in the notes, the value of biodiversity, and we're going to be talking about both the direct and indirect values. So we know that biodiversity maintains a healthy biosphere. And when we look at the direct values, this usually has to do with money, something you can recognize. It's easy to see. And the idea would be that if we can educate people on the values of biodiversity, that maybe they would be more likely to preserve that biodiversity. So we need variety. So the first direct value is medicinal value. So most of the US prescription drugs were originally derived, so that's what you need in the notes, most, from living organisms. And based on just the past rate of discovery, there are maybe 328 more drugs out there. That's an estimation, obviously. Money-wise, that's worth about $100 billion in value that could be found in the tropical rainforest. And the concern would be is don't keep cutting it down and eliminating that opportunity that there might be something within that is endemic to that area that we just haven't discovered yet. So, for instance, some examples, here we go. Treatments for leukemia, especially childhood leukemia, antibiotics like penicillin. Leprosy was discovered from a human leprosy cure from an armadillo. An amoeba was found that keeps pacemakers free of bacteria. So on your notes, I gave you all of those examples. I think the only thing you don't have is based on the past rate of discovery, maybe about $147 billion in value. You want to fill that in. And then I gave you all of those examples. So that is direct value number 1 is medicinal, why you would want to maintain biodiversity. Okay, direct value number 2 is an agricultural value. So wheat, corn, and rice crops are fairly uniform, and that makes us susceptible to a pest or a fungus that could attack that crop. And if we only have a monoculture of that, it could wipe it out, right? Like you think about the Irish potato famine. So wheat devastated by pests, you want to keep that genetic biodiversity. Those wild strains might help to protect us from and provide a resistant strain. So on your notes, you have wheat, corn, and rice crops are uniform. When devastated by pests, the wild strains they come from are the source of genes for disease resistance. So we can keep having that food available to us. Then also, in order to grow those crops, sometimes there are pests that devastate crops. And so we want to have the genetic diversity in things like wild ladybugs to help us biologically control those pests. So biological pest controls are economically important replacements when pests are pesticide resistant. Okay, and then another one is we need to have those crops pollinated. So I think this is an interesting stat. If you ate an apple today or drank coffee this morning, think a bee. About 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat is due to pollinators like bees. United States alone, and this is what you need in your notes, about $15 billion worth of crops each year are dependent upon bees. There are other pollinators too, like bats. And we need to make sure that we're protecting the habitats of all of them. One concern is disappearing hives and colony collapse disorder. We are so dependent on bees. This is a mite that grows on the bee that they think may be a cause of that. So on your notes, $15 billion worth of crops annually, and tracheal mites have wiped out about 20% of the population. So any hope for a resistant breed depends on wild bees. So number 1 was medicinal value. Number 2, agricultural value, and both of those are direct. And number 3 is consumptive value. So we do, yes, you can consume it like a food, but we want to look at sustainable practices, and maybe like a rubber tree, better than cutting it down is to keep it alive and then get rubber from it over time. We want to look at our fishing practices, that we're not overfishing, and that we can keep taking from that as a source, right? So on your notes, the cultivation of crops and the domestication of animals and farming have been successful. We need to look at things like sustained practices rather than destroying those ecosystems in how we fish and how we access their resources. So we need to look at aquaculture instead of like harvesting and destroying and cutting down those crops. Okay. We take so much that there's nothing left for us to keep taking. So think about it like that, if you want to keep having that as a source. Okay, so those are your 3 direct values: medicinal, agricultural, and consumptive. And now let's talk about some indirect values that we may not see right away. Often these indirect ways of having a healthy ecosystem, if we would depend on those more, they are less expensive than the heat, beat, and treat that we often go to. And I'll give you several examples of that. And one is the biogeochemical cycles. So it is better for us to depend on those natural decomposers than trying to do it ourselves. Man-made resources, some man-made, when we take over those cycles, sometimes we don't do that good of a job at that. So on your notes there, they contribute to the water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles that we depend upon. All right. And number 2, waste disposal. Decomposers break down organic matter and other waste into nutrients used by producers. Decomposition in nature is much more economical and complete than like a sewage treatment plant, where you keep adding more and more chemicals to it. Also, we want to think about things like phytoremediation, using plants as a natural way to detoxify some mess that we have made. So what you need under waste disposal is decomposition in nature is more economical and complete. Okay, number 3 is the provision of fresh water. Forests are like sponges, absorbing and releasing that water into our ecosystems. So provision of fresh water, most terrestrial organisms need fresh water, and forests are sponges. They hold and release water over time. So protect those forests. Number 4 on here is an intact ecosystem naturally retains soil and prevents erosion. When we do things like deforestation, that silt, that runoff gets into our waterways. It gets out into the oceans. It ends up covering coral reefs. So on prevention of soil erosion, intact ecosystems naturally retain soil and prevent erosion. And next, number 5, regulation of climate. Trees provide both shade and natural air conditioning. Globally, tropical rainforests act as a sink for carbon dioxide, right? Because they're fixing that CO2 and taking it out of the atmosphere. And when we cut down forests and then burn them in order to clear cut an area so we can grow some crop that we want, number 1, that's taking away something that was removing the carbon dioxide. In the act of burning those trees, we release even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So on your notes, trees provide both shade and natural air conditioning, and globally, tropical rainforests act as a sink for carbon dioxide. And last but not least is ecotourism. And that is, people are willing to spend money to go visit these beautiful places, right? And that can provide jobs, revenue for those areas. So it would be more economical to preserve them. And so globally, ecotourism generates about $77 billion in revenue overall. All right. And then on top, so you can add that in your notes. And then that would be all the indirect values. Okay, so medicinal, agricultural, and consumptive are direct, and then these last 6 were all indirect values. All right, so biodiversity, When we look at it, we need to look where the maximum biodiversity is, and that's usually near the equator. And those are the areas that we need to really work hard to protect. And we'll watch this little video. It's very short in class. Remembering the more complex the ecosystem, the better performance it has, the more likely it is to sustain changes in our environment, in our climate, and we are able to continue to use them as we need to. All right, and I got to keep going there, otherwise it's going to pause. There we go. All right, now the last topic, 36.4, is working towards a sustainable society. All right, so a sustainable society would be one that is able to provide the same goods and services for future generations of human beings as it does now. So you just needed the word future generations. We need to act like a species that is concerned about those future generations and not us right here and now. And so we need to look at the way we use those things. If you look currently, the way human society at present, when you look at how we use non-renewable energy sources, how we use materials, all of our processing and manufacturing, our waste energy, heat, those are all, kind of maxed out. We do very minimal amount of recycling, minimal use of non-renewable or of renewable energy sources, excuse me. So on your notes, today's society, little summary here. Land is being altered for human purposes. Land is being altered for human purposes. Agriculture requires large inputs of non-renewable energy. Most agriculture yield goes to feeding animals instead of feeding people. Running out of available supply of water within a given time frame. We primarily use non-renewable energy. This is linked to global warming, etc., and obviously too much pollution. So in a sustainable society, we would have maximal recycling, right? And minimal waste heat. So characteristics of a sustainable society: use only renewable energy sources, reuse heat and waste materials, and maximize recycling of products. So we're in this all together. So using those renewable energy sources and stop consuming and wasting so many resources, recycle. All right. And also we want to look at things when we analyze our quality of life, right? We don't want to just look how much money do we make, but what are we doing to make it a sustainable life? So assessing economic well-being and quality of life, don't just look at the gross national product, the GNP, to measure quality of life. Include non-economic indicators like resource depletion and environmental change. Resource depletion and environmental change. So the idea would be, let's be friends. So how can we do that? That will be our last topic of the year. And what we're going to transition into is biomimicry. And that's an approach that studies nature's best ideas and then tries to imitate those designs and processes to solve human problems. And that biomimicry will be our last discussion of the year. And if you are one of my students, I'll see you in class.